Good evening. It's great to see so many of you here for the William F. Buckley Jr. Program's event tonight. My name is Madeline Fortier, and I'm the president of the Buckley Program. First, I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. Before I introduce our guest, I'll say a few quick words about the program. The Buckley Program is dedicated to the promotion of intellectual diversity on Yale's campus. We at the Buckley Program have a strong belief that Yale would fail its principal mission of educating the leaders of tomorrow if it neglected to prepare students for the complexities that exist outside of the ivory tower. To put it more bluntly, if Yaleys leave this institution without learning that prudent and reasonable people will disagree on how to resolve issues at hand, then Yale has done its students a disservice. To prevent the entrenchment of this phenomenon, the Buckley Program hosts lectures, debates, and conferences with guests who hold views that offer a different perspective on issues that Yale students will hopefully solve once they leave New Haven. This year, the Buckley Program has about 300 student fellows, and the topics of our events have included assimilation, the census, modern parenting, and the media's role in the 2016 election. We hosted our first ever Ideas Forum to celebrate the top proposals from our nationwide contest on how to advance the ideas of a free society. And we hosted our first ever Free to Disagree event, a friendly and charitable discussion between former NPR CEO Ken Stern and Slate journalist Mike Pesca. Coming up on April 23rd, the Buckley Program will be hosting a public lecture with former U.S. Senator Dr. Tom Coburn. To freshmen, undergraduates, and graduate students who are not yet involved in the Buckley Program, I highly recommend that you visit buckleyprogram.com to learn more about applying to become a Buckley Fellow. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our guest for today. Governor Jeb Bush graduated from the University of Texas at Austin in 1973. He pursued banking in Texas and South America before moving to Florida to work in real estate. Bush became active in Florida and national politics in 1980, when his father ran for vice president on Ronald Reagan's ticket. Bush worked and managed numerous congressional and state campaigns in Florida and communicated frequently with his father, soon to become president. In 1998, Bush was elected as the 43rd governor of Florida by a 10% margin. Upon his election, he and his brother, future President George W. Bush, became the first pair of brothers simultaneously serving as governors of two separate states. During Bush's tenure, he reduced taxes and signed legislation to protect the Everglades. He made landmark strides in education reform, making Florida one of the only states to close the achievement gap through the promotion of charter schools. Governor Bush was reelected to a second four-year term in 2002. More recently, he ran for president in the 2016 election. The Buckley Program is honored to be hosting Governor Bush this evening. He will be speaking about his time in state office, his campaign for president, and the state politics of America and today in a lecture titled Restoring Conservatism in America. Let's give a warm welcome to Governor Jeb Bush.
Thank you. Thanks. So thank you. Thank you very much for that great introduction. It's not completely true. I'm not going to talk about the 2016 election. I'm still in therapy. So if you could forgive me for trying to avoid that. My psychiatrist really wants me to try to get beyond that. So we all have our views about 16. It was a joyous experience for me to be, in all honesty, to be able to have the chance to run. I met so many people. You get a sense of the struggles and the aspirations of a whole lot of people when you get a chance to run the way that I was privileged to do. It didn't work out for me, but you don't have to worry about me a bit. I have a huge safety net. The day I lost in South Carolina, I went home, and I went home to my wife of 43 years. I went home to children that actually love me. I have 4 perfect grandchildren. That wasn't supposed to be a joke, just for the record. I have 4 near-perfect grandchildren. I'll mention one of them. The first grandchild is named Georgia Helena Walker Bush. For those that follow kind of Bush folklore, we call her nickname is 41, because she has the same initials as the greatest man alive, my dad, who was a Yale graduate and a very proud one, I might add. In Georgia, let me see if I can get this right. Georgia is a quadra-hyphenated American. She is a Mexican, Texan, Iraqi, Canadian American. Her mom was born in Canada. Her dad was born in Miami. Her grandfather, her Gampy, was born in Texas, which, as you know, is a state, a country, not a state. And her abue was born in Mexico, and her mom's parents were born in Iraq. That's America at its best in my mind. And when this little precious girl, 15 years from now, turns 21 and fills out the godforsaken census form, which you all probably just began to do, she'll say not applicable when she has to fill out what she is. And I think not applicable is a pretty good place for Americans to be these days. What we ought to be is Americans first. We ought to have a set of shared values that unite us. I'm tired, I hope you are as well, of all of the tribalism and the breaking up in disparate parts that exists in this country. So thank you so much for letting me come here. I'm a huge Bill Buckley fan. I'm kind of the nerd in the Bush family. I actually watched Firing Line and enjoyed the hour-long shows. Most of the time when I did it, I would actually have to have a dictionary with me because Mr. Buckley had a range of vocabulary far beyond my capability of understanding every word that he said. But it was kind of inspiring to listen to a conservative with good humor and with a positive, hopeful, optimistic attitude. We've kind of lost that on our side of the political spectrum these days. We're not as hopeful and optimistic, and I don't think the left is particularly hopeful and optimistic either. We're turning in, our political system is becoming a forum for people reacting to the other side. And we're less hopeful and optimistic, and Mr. Buckley certainly inspired me and many others, particularly in his generation, to be hopeful and optimistic, to embrace a limited government agenda that could be meaningful. And because of his efforts and few other conservative intellectuals of his time, the rebirth of the conservative movement took place in the 1960s, which yielded a crushing defeat in 1964, but the beginning of what I think was a pretty good time for our country with the emergence of Ronald Reagan. And so I'm honored and privileged to be part of this effort. And I want to talk a little bit about why we're here, where we are today, and hopefully offer a constructive agenda going forward for conservatives in this country. Despite the success of the 2016 election, and just to remind everybody, Republicans dominate the state house, state senates of almost all of the states, certainly an extra majority in that regard. There are 34 or 33 Republican governors. 60% of all statewide elected officials are Republicans. A majority, 60% of the Congress, at least now, in the House are Republicans, and a majority in the Senate, and a Republican, at least in name only, in the presidency. And that is a majority, and yet we talk about this, at least I see, that we're kind of at the precipice of where we're going to be unless we re-engage with conservative thought. Conservatives used to support consistently limited government. Sadly, the most recent budget agreement of last week, which kind of got no fanfare because news isn't covered to the same extent that it once was, will push our federal deficit over $1 trillion a year in spite of the fact that our economy is growing at a really robust rate. We've never had those kind of deficits with the economic activity that we're seeing. Conservatives used to believe in free trade and embrace trade agreements that would allow us to expand goods and services across the world and lift people out of poverty and create economic opportunities at home, and would defend free trade, a hallmark value that has led our country to prosperity. But led by this president and many now on the conservative side of politics, they've joined the left in advocating overt protectionist tendencies that could create a lot of hardship for millions of Americans if we don't watch out. Conservatives have advocated entrepreneurial capitalism. It's kind of been the hallmark belief of conservative thought that if you allow people to risk their capital pursuing their dreams, that it creates more opportunities and more benefits for a large number of people. But today, at least in Washington, D.C., conservatives seem to follow the script of politicians that support crony capitalism. They support subsidizing renewables, subsidizing exports through the Exim Bank and other means for large corporations, subsidizing ethanol. One of the really foolish policies that creates environmental impacts that are negative, as well as higher prices for consumers across the board. Protecting the Jones Act, an idea that may have made sense when it was created, and I think it was in the early 20th century, today is completely obsolete and puts huge burdens, for example, on places like Puerto Rico that are struggling to recover their economic activity, and on it goes. Conservatives once were defined by a zeal for reform, and that still exists in many parts of our country, but not necessarily in Washington. Conservatives were the advocates for entitlement reform, education reform, regulatory reform, career civil service reform. And in D.C., you don't find many people advocating these things on either side, because if you advocate a provocative idea, the first thing that happens is you get your head cut off by the other side, and the net result is that we have gridlock. And other than the regulatory reform agenda that the Trump administration has implemented to roll back the Obama overreach, there's really not much focus on the reforms that will transform our country to be able to take advantage of this extraordinary time to be alive. Conservatives have advocated self-government. This is the hallmark of the Buckley philosophy as the best means to protect our liberty. And liberty at the heart of our country is, in many ways, is really the essence of what distinguishes us and makes us unique in the world. And as the institutions that aid us in being a self-governing people have eroded dramatically, you don't hear new ideas about how we can restore civil society and family life and robust communities around people so that they can live a self-governing life and have a fighting chance to live a life of purpose and meaning. And if there was ever need for a Bill Buckley-like approach to transforming conservatism in this country, it is right now. Maybe not a 19th century or a 20th century version of conservatism, but certainly a 21st century version of that. And sadly, the fracturing of the conservative movement could not come at a worse time. We are living in what should be the most extraordinary time to be alive. For younger people, you can't imagine the world that existed prior to your emergence and awareness of what's going on. It's an era marked by massive disruption in every aspect of our lives, for sure, but technology now provides us limitless opportunities to innovate and customize every aspect of our lives. My parents and people of that generation, and certainly the generation that I'm part of, could not imagine the world we're living in today. No one was that visionary to be able to emerge it. What you take for granted is something that is now going to develop at warp speed into our lives. But it's understandable that people are really anxious, legitimately so, about this innovative disruption in our economy, because it's creating some winners. Yeah, and a lot of these winners have huge net worths now, but it's also creating a lot of people that feel lost. In the past, we've relied on America's unique and exceptional safety net to create soft landings to help people get back on their feet. It was a uniquely American response to dynamism that has always been the hallmark of our country. But the safety net that has existed for generations, strong families, vibrant communities, engaged civic institutions, and world-class centers of education is withering away as our nation becomes more divided. Increasingly, we've relied on a larger federal government. The new version of the safety net is to use the federal government and government in general to provide comfort for those that truly need the help of government. But that is not as dynamic and vital as the safety net that I'm describing to you, which is one that protects us from our government, but also allows us to move forward. And so, you think about this and you can blame, as a conservative, it's easy to blame liberals for the breakdown of the social order, but conservatives have been part of this as well. Increasingly, as I said, we've relied on bigger government, and for the first time, in spite of these transfers of payments to people to provide for them, for the first time in American history, a majority of Americans believe their children will have less opportunities than what they have. And many people are actually questioning whether the promise of America still stands. I'd like to quote a quote from the 20th president of this country, James Garfield. And if you haven't read the book about Garfield, Destiny of the Republic, I encourage you to do so. I had no clue about Garfield. He wasn't on my top 5 list of great presidents. But if you read the book, you'll admire him greatly. And here's what he said. There is no horizontal stratification of society in the country like the rocks in the earth that hold one class down below forevermore and let another come to the surface to stay there forever. Our stratification is like the ocean, where every individual drop is free to move, and where from the sternest depths of the mighty deep, any drop may come up to glitter on the highest wave that rolls. Well, if you want to describe kind of the essence of what I believe our country should be about and has been about, it is that it doesn't matter where you start in life. If you start at the bottom, the depths of the ocean, or at the very top, you have a chance to get to the very top. That is what we should resolve to find common ground on to restore once again. Because today in America, that's not the case. If you're born poor in America, you're more likely to stay poor than any time in modern history. And if you're born wealthy, thank goodness for that. But you're also more likely to stay wealthy. And if you've read the books of Charles Murray or Robert Putnam, you begin to see that the social capital that we once had that allowed people to rise up from the bottom to the tops of the waves no longer has the vibrancy that it once had. And that stratification of our society is going to create huge strains unless we deal with it. I believe that the eloquent description of America, we can't just talk about it, the exceptional, extraordinary nature, we have to earn it again. We have to earn it each and every day. And that promise, I think, is something that we all should strive to achieve. The real issue isn't income inequality. That's the sterile political debate in Washington and other places. That's where you get into the class warfare argument. Because my belief is that poor people don't want rich people's money. They want their own money. They don't want people to be poor. They want to have the chance to rise up. So the issue is, how do we create a society where we have income and social mobility again? Where it doesn't matter where you start, if you live a life of purpose and meaning, you have a chance to be successful in your rising up. The simple data is that we're stuck now in this stratified America, and it needs to change. I don't know if you follow the works of Dr. Raj Chetty. He was a professor at the school up north a little bit, so you probably don't follow him that much. But now he's at Stanford, so that's okay. That's kind of neutral territory, maybe. And his team at the National Bureau of Economic Research recently studied income data spanning several generations of Americans. And what he found was that upward mobility has dropped by nearly half over the last 50 years. And the largest declines are in the middle class. The stalling out of social and economic mobility will only become more pronounced as we see this technological wave overwhelm us. If you think about the combination, the convergence of wireless technology, the Internet of Things, robotics, big data analytics, automation, artificial intelligence, all of this combined is going to accelerate this tidal wave of change, and the winners will do fine, but there's going to be a lot more losers. In fact, I would argue with you, as I've done today in many classes across the campus, that if you're born poor in the public hospital in New Haven today, it is likely, unless your life is altered on the course that the statistics would suggest that you're on, that you'll never have a job. That we're moving towards functional obsolescence of work. And that data is there for people to see. If they want to be in denial, fine. But the simple fact is, McKinsey has done a study last year that's forecasted that 45% of all the jobs Americans are paid to do today with existing technology, totaling $2 trillion of wages, could be automated with existing technology. And there's no social contract that can overcome that. If you're in a situation where you can't have a job and the access to the first rung on the ladder doesn't exist, it's very understandable why you may not have the drive to be able to provide for yourself and for your family. On the surface, innovation is a boom for commerce. And while I'm speaking here, there are people, I'm sure, on their phones right now buying something on Amazon because they're bored to tears. You, right there in the green shirt. I'm joking, man. Yeah, there you go. But innovation has consequences, too. A recent study showed that Amazon workers generate 1.2 million sales per employee. And a brick-and-mortar retail employee generates $100,000 worth of sales. Who's going to be the winner in that? And how many jobs are going to be lost in the financial service area, the healthcare industry, retail, across the board as we embrace this technological revolution, which creates great benefits, but also creates obsolescence in work? The 21st century conservative agenda can't be nostalgic about the past. It has to deal with these huge, pressing social issues, because that's where the challenge is that we face. It's so easy to fall prey to what the tweet was today, or what the local, whatever happened in the White House today, or what happened in Washington. But that stuff is irrelevant to the bigger challenges that we face and the opportunities that we need to embrace to make sure more people can live a life of purpose and meaning. So my suggestions are that it's time for a 21st century conservative agenda, and I have 5 humble suggestions. First and foremost, we need to offer policies that will create high sustained economic growth. Low growth works if you're rich. It's not so bad if you're poor, but it really puts huge burdens on the middle class. High growth creates opportunities that are significant. Second, conservatives need to embrace federalism, or what I call subsidiarity, where we move to a bottom-up country rather than a top-down country, which hasn't worked to the extent we would like. Third, conservatives need to lead the way with a radical transformation of pre-K to life learning and training. A new approach to make sure that people have the capacity to achieve earned success. Fourth, conservatives need to believe in fiscal responsibility once again. Look, if you're a voter and you're confronted with 2 people that have general views on everything, but one says we need more spending and the other says we need a little less than more spending, you're probably going to go for the guy that's offering the sirloin steak instead of the hamburger. If conservatives can't make the case for limited government and fiscal responsibility, then what's the point? This is the point, this is the essence of what Buckley and conservatives in a bygone era talked about. And it's time that we restore that, because we've lost our way without a doubt in that regard. Higher economic growth, which we now exists, where we finally have rising income for the first time in 8 years, is a great thing. But to sustain it over the long haul should be the long-term objective. If for 10 years we grew at 2% more than what we were planning to grow, the anemic 1.5% growth, if you just do a calculation of what 2% real growth does, compounded out for 10 years, it creates a Germany of economic activity in the 10th year. $4.5 trillion of more economic activity. That puts a lot of money in people's pockets. It creates a lot more money for government without higher taxes. It should be a nonpartisan or a bipartisan objective. And only the United States has the capacity in the developed world to grow at 3.5%, say, per year over the next 10 years. It would require significant changes in how we approach our economy, but it could be done. The tax reform and the tax cut is a first step to jumpstart economic growth, and I believe we could do more to be able to be more competitive in the rest of the world. Regulatory reform has created huge burdens, particularly for those that are starting out by creating jobs. And in the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen a slowdown of the startup of new jobs that could create the next generation of high-wage jobs for the future. And so regulatory reform has to be this. Now, this may be politically incorrect. It is. I apologize in advance. But we need to embrace the energy revolution in our country as well. The idea that hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, which has created this incredible boom of the lowest cost energy source in the world to allow us to reindustrialize our country, to create a huge benefit for consumers by lower utility costs, a bad thing? Maybe, in places that don't quite get it, it ain't a bad thing in places where there's more money in people's pockets and high-wage jobs are being created. We could be energy secure with North American energy sources and lead the world not just in traditional energy sources, but also in renewables. Somewhere in this country, I hope it's in a garage in Miami, Florida, there's someone that's going to figure out how to store energy with battery technology that lowers the cost to make it competitive. It's not going to happen in the Department of Energy, for crying out loud, but it will happen. It will happen by people pursuing their dreams through trial and error, as it always has happened in this country. By being energy secure, we will be competitive with the rest of the world. We need to do a lot more than that, of course. But the last thing I'd say about high sustained economic growth is we need to have a growing population of people that are qualified to be able to be successful in life. And the one thing that has given the United States an advantage over the last 5, 6 generations has been immigration reform. Another politically incorrect, apparently incorrect view, but we're not going to have the productivity gains that creates opportunities for everybody unless we deal with the simple fact is this country is one of the few countries in the world that can absorb immigrants with their pursuit of their dreams in a way where they share our common values and are successful. And when they're successful, so are we. Immigrants are younger, they form more families, they create more businesses, they own more patents, and if we designed an immigration system that protected our borders, that respected the rule of law, but shifted our immigration policy to an economic strategy, we would be on the path to getting that 3.5% economic growth. Here's the deal. Economic immigrants in this country comprise 15% of the legal immigrants that come to our country each year. Economic immigrants comprise 15%. In Canada, it's 80%. On a relative basis, 9 times more economic immigrants come to Canada than the United States. Which immigration policy is going to be the one that's the winner in a very competitive world? If we don't have this, here's the deal. 10 years from now, everybody in this room is going to be 10 years older. Anybody got a problem with that? Well, 10 years older means the demographic pyramid, the way we're dealing with our demography right now is going to look like this. And for us to grow and make sure that we can provide for the social contract that exists, it's got to look like this. And unless everybody under the age of 30 in this room is going to commit to me tonight that you're going to have 4 children, oh, okay, I didn't think so. Maybe recasting our immigration policy away from using it as a political wedge issue and turning it into an economic issue is part of the plan. The second idea is the restoration of subsidiarity, this Catholic idea that we solve problems first in our own lives, then in our families, then in our local communities, then we may ask a local government or a state government to help resolve the challenges that we confront, and then we ask the federal government to solve problems. That's federalism. That's the 10th Amendment. That's at the heart of who we are as a nation. And conservatives at the wrong time have begun to ignore this very basic concept. And a result of this is that we've ended up with the safety net that is the true and powerful one of strong families, of strong communities, of civic institutions around us, of faith organizations that have been meaningful for people's lives, eroding as it relates to the relationship they have with people, and the federal government has filled that void. If conservatives are going to win the debate, we need to offer an alternative to bigger government in Washington, D.C. And I think the vital, dynamic nature of our history leads us going forward towards a path that would be a much more vital way to lift people up. So if you're a conservative and you don't like the amount of government, the $50 trillion of net present value of the debt that young people are going to be paying if we don't change our entitlement system, then we better find ways to take care of the most vulnerable in our society. If you believe that it's inappropriate for a homeless person that's a veteran to live on the streets of any city in this United States, don't wait for the Department of Veterans Affairs, for crying out loud, to solve that problem. That won't happen. The ineptitude and the scale and the callousness of the institution itself with 350,000 employees, it's proven itself incapable of dealing with that. But why can't we act on our heart in our own communities to take care of veterans that truly are deserving of our help? The city of Houston, a big dynamic place, did just that. And there are no homeless living in the streets in Houston, Texas, and the federal government had nothing to do with it. There are examples after examples of this concept of subsidiarity. In Florida, I believe that early literacy was a core value for the state. And I believed it was important to make sure that everybody had a chance to participate. So I asked Colin Powell to come down and we created a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal of 200,000 mentors involved predominantly amongst third grade kids that were struggling readers. And we created a plan that said every state worker could spend 4 hours a month, as long as they spent an hour a week in a class helping a struggling reader. Businesses did the exact same thing. We broke the Guinness Book of World Records for simultaneous book reads in remote locations for middle school readers. I don't suggest breaking Guinness Book of World Records. They're a bear to deal with, and the compliance issues were incredibly difficult to do, but we did it. 234,000 people actually read the prequel to Peter Pan, written by great American author and great Floridian Dave Barry. And the simple fact was, it motivated people to get more involved. And this BHAG ended up being accomplished within 3 years. Florida, by the way, during that time, led the nation in terms of reading gains amongst third graders and fourth graders based on the nation's report card. You can do these things if you consider it something that is of value and purpose in your own life. And for conservatives more than anybody else, it should be essential for our success, because if we don't do this, the void will be filled by more government. If you already believe that more government's the solution, it really is not your responsibility to act on your heart to be able to help people. But the consciousness that I think is necessary for us to be successful requires us to begin to solve problems one community at a time. And so the bottom-up approach to challenging things has to be at the heart of what it is to be a 21st century conservative. The third is the stem-to-stern transformation of our education system. Here are the sad facts. A third of our kids are college and/or career ready in this country. We spend more per student than any country in the world other than the Benelux countries. I made the mistake in the campaign of saying more per student than any country in the world, and I got PolitiFacted. Have you ever had that happen to you? This is the judge and jury of smart people you never meet that tell you, it's a 3-alarm hair on fire lie or something like that. So they corrected me by saying it was the Benelux countries that spend more. Luxembourg, for crying out loud. It's like a rounding error. It's like a half-a-Dade county. I apologize. My bad. The simple fact is we spend a heck of a lot of money, and the results are a third of our kids are truly college and/or career ready. Then, when you count the number of students that graduate with a 4-year degree, 60% of full-time students graduate with a 4-year degree in 6 years. 60%, not 100%. And it's not in 4 years, it's in 6 years. And we've seen the tripling of student debt literally in the last decade of time. This is record debt. Everybody in the room that has participated in this wonderful program understands this. You can't file for bankruptcy. It's recourse debt. It comes before everything but your income taxes you have to pay. And the net result is we're not getting the kind of throughput necessary to make that a logical investment. Better to reform how we finance our higher education system, and better to make it more relevant so that young people have a fighting chance to be able to live a life of purpose and meaning. The education system of this country was the best in the world for a long while, but we've been resting on our laurels thinking that every school is like Yale. Well, you may not be hanging out in other schools. They're not. Yale's a wonderful place. Every kid that graduates from here will likely do it in 4 years. They'll likely do it with a degree that people will see, oh, I went to Yale. Wow, pretty important. I mean, you have this prestige factor that will lift you up without a doubt, and you've earned it by working hard to make that happen. But what about the kids at Cal State Fullerton or University of Central Florida, loaded up with debt and not being able to get a degree that allows them to get a meaningful job? This challenge, how we educate from pre-K on through life and how we train for the next generation of jobs, should be one that Republicans and conservatives begin to advocate and begin to win. That means more school choice across the board. That means more accountability. It means focusing on new technologies to customize the learning experience for each child. Time should be the non-constant, and learning should be the constant. When you master the material, you move on. When you don't, you continue to work on it so that you can be successful with the next building block because you've mastered the first. That system is a 21st century system. Liberals have a hard time advocating this because basically the economic interests of the adults in the system drive their political thinking. Republicans have a huge opportunity to be on the side of struggling families that deal with this issue, and that certainly should be part of our agenda. And then finally, I think we need to become conservative again as conservatives. This idea that you pass a budget where you negotiate and you say, I'll give you $200 billion or I'll give you $150 billion and I'll have $150 billion of additional spending, that's a compromise of $300 billion of new spending over 2 years. That is a dereliction of duty. And that $300 billion in 2 years turns out to be $1.8 trillion over 10 years, far greater than the fiscal impact of the tax cut. And each time Republicans blink on the concept of limited government, they lose a constituency. There are people that actually believe that we should make sure that the next generation doesn't have trillions of dollars of debt on their backs. Today, that number is $50 trillion for entitlements and trillions of dollars, $21 trillion in the federal debt, and trillions of dollars of unfunded pension liabilities at the state and local level. Who's fooling who? If we don't stand for limited government and reforming these things so that the next generation has a fighting chance to be able to be successful, then we're leaving a legacy that will be a huge embarrassment when we leave. And I think conservatives will never win elections again unless we get back to being conservative, which means believing in limited government and actually acting on it, and not blaming the dog eating their homework, all sorts of other things. There's all sorts of reasons, the 60-vote rule, all these things are explanations for a failed implementation of the core belief that William Buckley believed in and most conservatives believed in, and we need to stop blinking if we're going to be successful going forward. It's always easier to give out the candy or always advocate the butterscotch sundae as the solution to whatever ails us. But if they're going to do that, as I said, might as well vote for the person that offers more cream on the top rather than just a little bit of butterscotch sundae. Triple down on the sauce, because we'll never be able to outspin the other side. That's the very nature of our political system. Finally, let me just suggest to you that I've got tire marks on my forehead, so I have some experience in this. I think it's important for Republicans or conservatives in general to have a Buckley attitude about all this. Good humor might be used once in a while. There's a lot of funny things going on. I don't know if you've noticed. I mean, some of the stuff is pretty amazingly funny. Others is just regular old funny. But we can't be, in order to draw people towards our cause, as Buckley did, we have to use good humor. We have to not believe that people that disagree with us are evil people. They just might be wrong. There's a difference. The tone of how you address your opponent, how you engage people is really important. I love firing line for the very basic reason. Again, I told you I had a hard time understanding every one of the words that you'd have to go to a dictionary to try to decipher. But the simple fact is, William Buckley always debated the other side. He was always respectful of someone who didn't agree with him. And he almost always won the debate as well because he was informed, he was hopeful and optimistic, and I think that's what we need to engage in. So as a conservative, when we see people that are doing the exact same thing that our heads exploded when we thought that Barack Obama or Bill Clinton did, and someone on our team does the exact same thing, stop being a hypocrite. Challenge that person because they're putting a mark on conservatism when they behave the way they behave. We need to stop the hypocrisy, we need to stop the demonizing, and we need to lead the way towards a more civil discourse for our country. Because whether you are a conservative or a liberal, at the end of the day, the only way we move forward is that we find common ground on a few things and build on that. And the political environment in Washington, D.C. particularly makes that near impossible. I, for one, don't want to wait for someone to come up with the idea of how to break this. I think as part of a 21st century conservative agenda, we need to be the ones that do it. And one way to do it is to say to our fellow tribesmen and women, shame on you when you don't stand up for decency. Shame on you when you allow someone to attack the disabled. Shame on you when you use racist thoughts. Shame on you when you have candidates that are not conservative that steal the moniker of being a Republican or conservative. Stand up for what's right. then you have the moral high ground to be able to advance the cause of conservatism with the broad number of people that are sick and tired of the putrid political environment that exists in this country. At the end of the day, if we get this right, I wish I was 21. That's kind of work in progress. I'm not sure I want to be 21 given the debt that we see and the problems that we face, but you know what? I'd rather be 21 even with the chaos that we have. It's a lot better than 65. But the simple fact is, this should be the greatest time to be alive. We're going to live in a time where diseases are cured. Cancer will be cured. We're going to live in a time where people are going to be driving around, living purposeful lives, doing the things they want to do and not having to have a car wreck because we're going to have autonomous vehicles. We're going to live in a time where our environmental challenges will, not by government, but probably by innovation and the dynamism of this great country of ours are going to solve problems that we can't even imagine. We're living on the verge of the greatest time to be alive. The only way that it'll be that way is if we engage. So my final point to you all, particularly young people, is I hope you don't watch what goes on in politics and look like it looks like it's a reality TV show. And it's kind of fun to watch maybe, but I don't want to be engaged in it because it's got all this ugliness. I hope you reject that kind of attitude. I hope that you recognize that you all are probably going to be the ones that fix this. Millennials particularly are going to be, the next generation is going to be the generation that gets us back on track. And God willing, there'll be enough conservatives inside that group of people that will protect our liberty and maintain the historic, wondrous nature of our country. It still is the greatest country that exists in the world, and we can still lead the world in so many ways. And with your leadership and your active involvement, that's exactly what's going to happen. Thank you. What side do you want to be? Okay.
Thank you for your talk, Governor.
You bet.
So to kick questions off, I've got a first one. How do you suggest conservatives like yourself, about 45 years my senior, reach out to us millennials in so far as spreading the conservative message? You mentioned how we'll be in part of changing things.
Yeah, no, I think elected officials, conservatives that are running for office or elected officials should reject reactionaryism. The idea that your organizing principle is the other guy's bad, their philosophy's wrong, they're bad. We've done that pretty effectively. We've won a lot of elections by doing that. The Democrats may do the same in 2018. It's not a sustainable philosophy, though. You can't just be against things and have it be sustained over a generation of time. And the left will experience that as well, perhaps, but we've experienced it, and it's kind of hard to change when you've had so much success. I mean, remember, 60% of all elected officials at the state level are Republicans. So people that are in that realm, they probably say, hey, things are going pretty good. But the worm turns pretty quick, and it'll turn if we continue to be reacting to the overreach on the other side. So first and foremost, stop being reactionary and embrace a positive, hopeful agenda. The other thing I'd say that it's a question of emphasis and tone. I think millennials or young people just, they're very different. Their priorities are different. So emphasize the priorities that younger people have. Third, I'd say, for whatever reason, Republicans kind of have lost their, not all Republicans, and by the way, anything I said here that said, conservatives are this or that, this is not, unanimous, this is not absolute, but we've kind of lost the embrace of science, of innovation in science. We're not as excited about that. And I think younger people totally get the power of innovation, the embrace of science, whether it's environmental policy or other areas. We should be back being the ideology that is not fearful of the future, that really sees it as of great potential, and that scientific discovery And innovation, technological innovation, is going to yield unforeseen benefits, the likes of which we can't even imagine.
Yes, so now we'll take some questions from the audience.
We got mics?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
And so you were talking about how technological obsolescence is something we're going to have to deal with within the next few decades. And a lot of people who are closer to the left side of the spectrum typically suggest something akin to a universal basic income to combat that. What are your thoughts on that?
The universal basic income is an idea that is kind of a defeatist idea in my mind. First of all, we spend $1 trillion right now transferring monies for basically the next generation, their wealth to the current beneficiaries that fit the programs. It's not, we're not transferring a dollar from someone's pocket because we don't have the money. We have $1 trillion deficit, but we're transferring $1 trillion as though there's no, there's no moral implication of that. Just pause one more time. That's wrong. $1 trillion deficits with 3% growth is obscene in my mind, but that's what exists. I think that is a disservice to people that aspire to a better life. Work is purposeful beyond, money being earned. Work is a moral value. The idea that you give someone something without it being earned is going to almost guarantee that they're not going to live happy lives. And the pursuit of happiness is kind of at the core of this. It may sound corny, but a happy life is a purposeful life. And so I would argue that what we need to do is to build capacity for people to be successful on their own and that their success is earned. If you look at the studies for lottery winners, I don't know if you've seen in these studies for people that win the lottery, they're miserable by and large. I mean, they're temporarily happy, I'm sure, for like a day or two. Then people start leeching off of them, and then they start drinking, and it's really a tragedy in a lot of ways. And this is not anecdotal. This is done by, probably Yale professors doing the research, so it's got to be perfect. And so it's the purposeful nature of work that if you take away, I think is a problem. Some version of that where you provide support for people but make sure that they also have a chance to work so they feel like they're invested in their own future is the likely solution to that, and there may be common ground between left and right on that. By the way, that's the idea that's, emanates in places, the guilt-ridden parts of the country where really rich people exist, like Silicon Valley, and they feel, oh my God, we got to give people a guaranteed income because I'm worth $1 billion for my pet.com thing or whatever. I think they need to get out and talk to people a little more, not on organized tours like Mark Zuckerberg did to find, meet the little people in Ohio and all this stuff. I mean, they actually need to learn that people do want to have the chance to live lives of purpose and meaning. They do want to do it on their own. They want to be lifted up. They want to be helped to be able to do it, but they want the barriers that make it harder for them to do it to be torn down first. And we have a compelling story here that the elites on the left, by and large, don't get. It's a bad week for Mark Zuckerberg. I probably shouldn't kick him anymore.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. So since
cool T-shirt, brother.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So going from our most recent Republican administration to the current one, there's been a major shift in foreign policy attitude as well as the amount of technology available. Do you have a particular vision in mind for conservative foreign policy going forward?
It's hard to tell what there is no Trump doctrine per se. There's kind of the president's tweets that create a reset that gets people all fired up, but then the actual policy is not dissimilar to that, of maybe not President Obama's, but of my brother's. Think about Russia. The president can't mention Putin by name. He has some aversion to that seems to the point of obsession, but his policies have really been stronger against the Putin regime. And so my advice is to kind of wait before you figure. This is work in progress. He's in his second year. He didn't come into office with much of a doctrine about how he was going to run the foreign policy, but he's put generally good people in positions, And I think we need to focus on what he does rather than what he says. I like some of the unorthodox nature of, not the chaotic part, but the just trying to reset the relationships that exist, both friend and foe alike. I think that's pretty good. I mean, we keep talking at international fora about NATO, about Europeans spending 2% of their budgets on defense, and we talk about it, and they never did it. Trump comes in and says, I don't know about NATO. Article 5, that's negotiable. Like the guys in Estonia, they're freaking out. And of course, they're the ones that actually have a budget that's higher than the 2%. But it's a wake-up call for Germany. If they're going to lead Europe, then they need to step up. The United States has had a heavy burden in that regard. We've benefited from our leadership, but I think it's fair for the United States to say these alliances need to be reinvigorated. Trading agreements that were negotiated in 1990 need to be updated for sure. So, I mean, I'm not critical of the Trump agenda. I just think it's kind of work in progress as it relates to foreign policy. I am a little nervous about the uncertainty he creates, thinking that there's some negotiating advantage. There isn't any. That may work in a real estate deal in Manhattan or something. I don't know if it works there either, but it doesn't work when you're trying to create order and stability, because that's ultimately the United States. For us to be successful, order and security around the rest of the world is probably a pretty good thing.
Thank you, Governor Bush. And kind of on that same note, I know you've tried to stay away from doom and gloom, but there are certain places in the world that look like they're encapsulated in this whole thing of doom and gloom. North Korea, namely Venezuela right now.
Yeah.
How do you think, not necessarily the Trump administration, but the 21st century conservative should deal with those sorts of countries?
Yeah, so I do think there are values that the United States needs to advance in the world. Every administration has a different balance, for sure. The president seems to be focused on the commercial interests of the country. I got it. There's nothing wrong with that. Rebalancing that is probably a good thing. But to ignore the moral underpinning of our foreign policy and just kind of say it's no longer important that we can deal with everybody probably will create more of the people we don't want to deal with. That there is a legitimate role. It's not the sole role. I mean, President Carter probably went too far as it relates to human rights. But for us, who? I mean, Venezuela is a great example. I lived there for 2 years. When I lived there, it was very different than it is now. Now you have the richest resource country in South America where people are starving. The largest refugee flow of people outside of Syria, which is one of the great humanitarian tragedies of modern times, is Venezuela. And yet, part of it is the news is so focused on what the tweet said this morning at 6 o'clock and, how people responded to it and everybody's hair's on fire. And it's all about this vicious cycle inside of the vortex of D.C. that legitimate news doesn't get covered. But the United States could play a really constructive role in advancing a different result in Venezuela. We could mobilize the region in the support. But if Colombia and the other countries surrounding Venezuela don't believe the United States cares, they're not going to engage because there's huge risks for them doing that. American leadership really matters, and I think having some understanding both of humanitarian issues as well as human rights issues is a legitimate part of our foreign policy. It shouldn't be the sole reason. It's okay, you can ride a bike and chew gum at the same time, for crying out loud, and this would be a good example of it. It's in our economic interest for a new Venezuela, for sure. It's certainly in our interest if we stand for the dignity of man to allow people to be in the condition that they are in our own front yard, at least from my front yard, I live in Miami, is well worth it. And North Korea, no president, no administration has gotten it right. Some have gotten it a little better. We kind of go 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. The president has a golden opportunity now as he renegotiates kind of the trading relationship with China to be able to leverage that into a constructive role as it relates to North Korea. And I hope and pray he does, because that's a huge national security risk for us and an even bigger risk for the region that we depend on for our economic livelihood.
I guess just to add on to that question, you mentioned a bit during your talk about principles of subsidiarity and federalism and sort of the importance of not having a top-down approach, but rather, having individuals and community involvement take a larger role in things. How does that sort of map on to your vision for foreign policy?
It doesn't.
It doesn't? I don't. Okay, because
No,
it seems sort of contradictory to.
Well, that's a good point. I should have. The one thing that, if you asked a conservative 30 years ago, if you asked Ronald Reagan, he would have probably said it a lot more in a joyful way and be kind of funny. He would have said, you want the federal government, actually he may have said this, the federal government needs to protect our shores and carry our mail, maybe not carry our mail, and get the hell out of the way. That's generally, if you believe in subsidiarity, it's the role of national security remains in the hands of Washington, D.C. Our military, and frankly and interestingly, the one institution in our society that continues to be enormously successful in lifting people up and giving people opportunities that otherwise they wouldn't have is the military. And it's the one institution that is still held in high regard across the board. So this is the one place the federal government has gotten it right, and so I'm glad you brought that up. You can't have Miami could have a foreign policy, I guess, but most places couldn't. We have 60% of our people in Miami-Dade County are born in another country, so we have a de facto foreign policy, but not a national foreign policy. That has to be done through the agencies up there.
Hi, Mr. Bush, in your speech, you mentioned some notion of a safety net, that a conservative safety net that's different from what the left proposes, and then you just trashed the idea of universal basic income. I was wondering if you had any specific details about what that safety net would look like, given what you said about the obsolescence of labor going forward.
So the federal safety net will, if you add up all the entitlement programs, will likely grow without any change if we have no reforms, is projected to grow by the Congressional Budget Office, I believe, by $7 trillion over the next 10 years. That's a lot of money when you consider we spend $4 per year. It's all of the growth of the government spending. And as long as our interest rates are low and we're the international currency of record and people continue to lend us money, which is not a foregone conclusion, we can continue to have deficits, but there's going to be a point in time where that's not the case. It could be relatively soon if one of the tools for retaliation against tariffs on Chinese trade is to say, good luck with that Treasury auction you got. That's a pretty good retaliation. That could create some shorts could get tightened in D.C. for that. So that $7 trillion delta is if we do nothing. What I would propose is, and conservatives have generally advocated this, moving Medicaid back to the states and freeing them up to allow them to create new programs for the poor that could be done with better outcomes, and I think a reduced growth in the spending. I think the contract on Medicare similarly could be reformed to raise, as we're proposing to raise the retirement age, to do something similar as it relates to Medicare so people can stay in their private insurance for an extended period of time. Social Security, which also is part of this actuarial deficit of $50 trillion, you could raise the limit, the income limit so that higher income people pay a little bit more, raise it over a period of time, raise the retirement age. You could allow for people that continue to work past the age of 65, an increasing number of older people do that, to be able to keep their contribution, their payroll contribution, which in effect goes for their ultimate retirement already. You could just forward it to them so that they get to keep that as a tax cut that goes directly to their income. There's all sorts of things that we could do and protect it for those that have it now. If we begin this process and gradually phase to a new Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security system, you could cut that $7 trillion incremental cost dramatically, and more importantly, 10, 20 years from now, you could move towards solvency. With high economic growth and those reforms, you could save Medicare and Medicaid for those under the age of 50. If you don't do it, you know, it'd be great for some of us in the room, not so great for everybody else. So Medicare for all, without any reforms attached to it, will accelerate that $7 trillion. That's what will likely be the 2020 mantra for the 15 people who are going to run for president on the Democratic side. And that sounds great. It's a phenomenal soundbite. It's nice and simple, easy to understand, and it could be a winning issue for Democrats because Obamacare is really complicated and convoluted, and the private system, that we haven't reformed it, so people can't see that option. And unless we get in the game and offer something different as it relates to health care insurance reform and entitlement reform, I think we lose that issue in 2020. Thankfully not in charge of the microphone.
Thank you so much for being here. You mentioned talking around campus. Did you talk to different classes today? And tell us more about the topics and who you talked to. So
I went back in time to hear students talk about anti-communism and communism in the 40s and 50s, and I totally forgot that, it's just, you kind of move on once things happen and you move to a new era. Having lived in Miami, I have personal experience with the question of anti-communism and communism for sure, because Miami's dynamism is created by people leaving communist countries by and large, and many others now have come as well. What I was impressed with in that class and the class, what was the class called? The journalism?
Yeah, 21st century political journalism.
Yeah, it's basically what the heck's going on in the press. Basically, that would be the title I'd call it. What I'm impressed with is, I mean, the subject matter is interesting, of course, and stimulating, but the caliber of and the professors were great, fantastic. The students, these great universities, I've spoken at quite a few of the fancier schools, and what I'm impressed with is the caliber of the students. I mean, Yale's a great university for lots of reasons, but the primary reason is the caliber of the students that are here. Same with Harvard, same with these schools. And I'm sure the experience that they gain matches the contribution they make, but it may not be a big net, improvement. I think the students are what make this place special, and every question, every comment was incisive and incredibly eloquent and smart, and everybody actually looked like they did their homework, which I vaguely remember my 2 years at the University of Texas. Before I got out, I don't remember doing much of that.
Do you have any suggestions for students or young individuals on things that we can do to sort of help promote a conservative agenda, but just on an individual level within our communities?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that could be done. One is this whole outside of politics, solving problems, that...
Like innovation?
Well, just solve, look, there's so many ways now to use technology and just organize around a problem. And it's a problem that may not be insurmountable. And we start solving problems again. That, in essence, is protecting liberty in a lot of ways, because the default of that is an overwhelming demand on government. That sounds like removed, maybe. It's certainly one step removed, but it is we're not as self-governing as we once were, and I don't believe that even if we're a center-right country, which I believe we still are, the overwhelming nature of demands on government will turn us to something different. So, acting on your heart it sounds corny, but it's really powerful, and many people I know do that. I would say get involved in things that are more purposeful in politics. So. I wouldn't, if you were given the chance to be a appropriation staffer in the state of New York or the state of Florida, rather than appropriation staffer in the Ways and Means Committee or whatever budget committee that exists in Washington, go state, because they actually have to balance the budget, There's a beginning and an end. They don't do these omnibus bills with a bunch of crap laid up on top of crap. I mean, literally 1,000-page bills no one reads. There's no democracy that, as we define it, that's going on there. That's just lard that's filled to the brim. It's disgusting. And I think you'll lose your enthusiasm and idealism, and I don't want you to do that. So go to the state level. I mean, sausage is still made there. It's not pretty, but at least it's more transparent. And most places have 2 months where the session goes on and it's over and they've balanced a budget. It forces compromise because you can't leave town until a budget's balanced. And the states that cheat are the ones that are going bankrupt, which is not a great incentive for other states. So I would, if you're interested in politics and policy, I would focus on the state level where there still is a lot of really interesting ideas being developed.
Hi, so...
Where are you?
Right
here.
Way
back there.
Way in the back, yeah. So I think in the last 5 or 10 years, we've sort of seen this growth of partisan politics, and especially in this past presidential election. And in particular, something that almost seems like extremist politics. So my question is, what would you suggest for those of us who are moderates who sort of fall on one side of the spectrum on some issues and on the other side of the spectrum for others? Because it often seems like we have to choose or almost not vote at all because the choices are so incredibly polarized.
Yeah, great question, great comment. We've always had partisanship, just for the record. It's the nature of a two-party system is there's partisanship. What's a little different is our culture from which our politics comes, not the other way around, is very different. And this is a theory I have. I don't know if you all agree with it, but I think our politics comes from our culture. And our culture is really driven. Watch TV if you do. I mean, the things people watch now are reality TV. It's not a surprise to me that the betrayals and the narratives and the tension and the theater and the drama of reality TV plays out each and every day in Washington, D.C. now, because one of the great actors in that genre is the President of the United States. So it's a skill set that he earned in this new culture. And so the first thing I would suggest is reject it. Reject the demonization on the left and right. There are nut jobs on both sides. And as a Republican, for example, I don't think there should be institutional support for a guy like Ray Moore. If he wasn't accused, I mean, if he wasn't convicted as a pedophile, I mean, he's not running. You don't have to be convicted to be able to say no. A United States senator should not be seated that had his past. And institutional Republicans should have rejected that out of hand. We should reject. And gosh, my guess is that most Republicans probably did. Many of them were nervous about saying it out loud. And on the left, the same thing takes place. There is vitriol and hatred across the board, and it should just be rejected by people in those parties, for starters. There should be no silence. And it's amazing on how both sides, the hypocrisy of if Chuck Schumer, if someone does something bad on the Republican side, Schumer just goes nuts. And if the exact same thing happens to one of his colleagues, God forbid if you spoke up, and the same on our side. There should be there's ways to challenge that out loud and openly, but also in elections. The other thing that I think would be helpful is to force yourself to acquire news from different sources. Because one of the things we talked about in the class today was that you have these silos of where news comes, and there's not a common set of facts. It's really easy to imagine how people would have disagreements if they don't even have the right set of facts. I mean, in the old days where facts were more or less the same, we still had pretty good fights. I mean, there was partisanship, and we would call names of people that might be too liberal, and I got called all sorts of things that I can't repeat here. But at least we had a set of common facts. Now it's like playing three-dimensional chess. Now you have the same friction of difference of views on ideology, and people actually are more righteous about their views because they're only getting one side of the story. And there's no editors anymore. There's no editors. So you have to be your own curator, to new term, or editor of the news. And challenge yourself, because the studies I've seen, and I'm actually nerdy enough to read this stuff, is people become less tolerant of other people's views and more righteous of their own if they just consume one set of facts, one set of, they watch Fox and they're a Fox believer, they become less tolerant of people that watch MSNBC and vice versa. So do it as an exercise. Force yourself to read the New York Times editorial page if you're a conservative. I know it's really hard because I've tried it. I'm not practicing what I preach all the time in this regard, but I do read the New York Times now, which I didn't do before. And I get a different, even just in the reporting, I get a different view. I think we need to broaden out the information that we get, just with the simple objective of just validating the idea that someone that disagrees with you is not a bad person. You just disagree with them. And that civility that comes over time through 1,000 different conversations can actually create compromise. Because a lot of times in Washington and in politics right now, even when you agree, you can't agree. I mean, it is so weird. Even when there's not really an ideological construct for a particular debate, if the R's say it's, the sun's up, the D's say the moon's out, and vice versa. And that's dangerous for a democracy that requires consensus, particularly one that has these self-imposed rules of 60 votes in the Senate, which is not embedded in our Constitution. It's not a law. These are Senate rules. There is no 60 votes for anything in the Senate. And it's the only way to rebuild that is either change the rule, and Mitch McConnell is going to send me a text message probably by the time I leave tonight, or figure out ways to forge consensus in different ways. The final thing I'd say, and I'm not an advocate of this, but our two-party system exists not by rule, not by constitution, not by law. It exists. It's a tradition. It exists because it was effective. Is it effective now as it was? Kind of work in progress, isn't it? And particularly young people, a majority of young people are non-party identified for the reasons that you eloquently discussed. You could lose the two-party system and we could have a personality-driven, Oprah may run and George Clooney, put him in there as vice president, and The Rock's going in. He's the Miami boy, I'm kind of for him. And, you could have a personality-driven, doubling down on what we have now, or you could have a multi-party system, or you could have four parties, the hard left, the hard right, and the right. Who knows? There's nothing to assure the two-party system will be here forever. It's a phenomena based on effectiveness, and it's not as effective as it was.
Well, there's time for one last question.
Hi, thanks for coming, Governor Bush. How should reasonable, moderate conservatives respond to the rise of racial animus, and frankly, in the Republican Party, which has replaced the sunny optimism of the 80s, say?
Yeah.
How should we reject both dismissing their legitimate concerns as them being deplorables and reject the agenda of Breitbart?
Yeah, I mean, totally agree with both rejections. The idea that people are deplorable, it's deplorable to say it, and it's wrong. And it's thankfully, the reason why Hillary Clinton's not president, just for the record here. So for some of us, that's not a bad thing. But the sunny optimism has to be grounded in a set of, you can't just be sunnily optimistic and not have any substance behind it. It's not happy time here. You have to have optimism grounded in the principles that you believe in, from which come ideas that are timeless, that have to be crafted, that are relevant to the world we're moving towards. And I think we've kind of lost our way, and we have the split of the conservative movement into many different parts. We have libertarians, we have paleocons that want to go back to 18th, 19th century agricultural living or whatever. No one's been able to give me a good definition of that hibernated form of conservatism. We have traditional conservatives, we have evangelical conservatives, we have all these hyphens, and we've broken ourselves up in those disparate parts. There isn't an overriding agenda that is based on a set of policies moving forward. And I think we need to have that detail behind the optimism and believe it. It can't just be kind of a false, all is well. I actually believe it. And I think enough Republicans or conservatives believe it as well. So, but reject the reactionary side of the party, reject the fringes, just as Buckley did with the John Birch Society, with nativist thoughts that are, that just have an undertone of racism. That kind of attitude needs to be rejected out of hand. We'll never win elections if we send a signal that we only want a certain segment of Americans to join our team. That certain people aren't qualified to do it for whatever reason. That's the signal. It's not a fair belief, but in 1,000 different ways, that's what a lot of people hear. And we have to rectify that by offering a more compelling agenda that is hopeful and optimistic. And if we do it, I think we win elections. If we don't, I think we start losing elections given the demography of our country. One man's opinion.
Well, thank you for your
Thanks.
time.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.